Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. As Eric said, my name is Juan Saldarriaga, and I work at the Brown Institute for Media Innovation. I just want to give you a very brief background on what we do. We're primarily a grant-giving organization. Every year, we give out around $1 million in grants to groups that want to do something interesting with technology and media and journalism. We are actually a bi-coastal organization. We're half at Stanford and half at Columbia. And this year, we just gave out our Magic Grants, and there are a number of those dealing with COVID. One of them has actually been very successful, and you've probably seen some of the news reports that have been done in part because of this grant. The grant is submitting FOIA, so Freedom of Information Act requests, to every state and local agency in the country about anything to do with COVID. So basically they're getting all of the emails and the correspondence between state and local officials about how they're dealing with COVID in their municipalities. So those are the types of grants that we finance. We also have some great programming throughout the year. This year, we don't know exactly how that's going to happen, probably all virtual. But we have some workshops on technical stuff for journalists and some talks by important authors and collaborations with outside organizations like the one we do with the Magnum Foundation around photography. Personally, my research has always been focused on data, and especially transportation data and migration data. The map in the center is a project I did a couple of years ago looking at forced displacement in Colombia, the country, because of their civil war with the guerrillas. And the graphic on the left is a recent project we did with some folks at the journalism school and at CIPA, looking at the terms of service of the big four tech companies. So Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Google, trying to understand what data they are allowed to collect from us and what they can do with that data. In short, our conclusion was that they're allowed to collect whatever they want, and they're allowed to do whatever they want with our data. But there's a very thorough and deep visualization piece, interactive visualization piece. If you go to mappingdataflows.org, you'll be able to play around with all of the different types of data that they collect and see what they're allowed to do. Okay, so the project I'm going to be talking about, I have to preface it by saying this is a work in progress. We are, along with David King, who's a professor at Arizona State University, we're looking at transportation inside New York City during the pandemic. You've probably seen many articles talking about how there has been a dramatic decrease in subway use in New York City. That has caused a deep financial crisis for the MTA. And the subway has even started shutting down between midnight and 5 a.m., which is something they had never done before. And New York City subway was one of the only subways in the world that would operate 24 hours. So this is sort of the background. Even now with the reopening, these are statistics by the MTA showing how even for the week ending July 24th, the number of riders was still down 77% or 78% in some cases compared to the same time last year. So there is indeed a huge decrease in ridership. So we wanted to analyze if this decrease in ridership, if this lockdown is having any effects on the way New Yorkers move around the city. This is a map we did in a class I taught on the spring, looking at the change in subway ridership. The bigger the circle and the redder the circle is, the bigger the change, and compared to median household income. And you can see from the map that the parts of the city that have lower income have seen lower decreases in subway ridership of course, these are, as we've seen in the press, a lot of the people that are considered essential workers are also part of low-income population, and they still rely on the subway to travel to work. Most of the upper income neighborhoods can work from home, and so those stations have seen the greatest amount of decrease. Recently, also in the press, there have been articles talking about how Citibike has replaced a lot of the subway trips. People are arguing that we should make this change permanent in New York, building more bicycle infrastructure, building or getting rid of a lot of the parking, the street parking. And there was a recent article with the headline, "City bikes, scooters, skateboards, anything but the subway." So our project was, we wanted to test whether that was true or not, and if the data reflected this change, and what could we learn from this change. So again, this is a work in progress, and this is what we've done so far. First, of course, we analyzed subway ridership. The blue line is subway ridership for 2019. The orange is subway ridership for 2020. And you can see the dramatic drop in subway ridership. It goes down from an average of around 30,000 trips per week to somewhere around 5,000 trips per week. One thing that's interesting here, you see some markers for the timeline. The subway ridership actually starts around, the drop in subway ridership actually starts around March 7th, where when the governor declares a state of emergency, way before there is a mandate for all non-essential workers to stay home. So, and what we've seen across the study is that the pronouncements from the state are actually going a little bit after the changes in transportation are visible. So people are acting before the state declares the stay-at-home rule, or even with the reopening, you will see how people are actually starting to change their behavior before the official reopening dates. This is the difference in weekly subway trips. The dashed line at the top is 0%, so it's where the level is the same. And here you see that the subway ridership dropped to around 90%, dropped by 90% to what it was. And even after the phase 1 reopening started, the subway usage was rising, but it was still extremely low compared to 2019. Citibike is a slightly different story though. Again, the blue line is 2019, the orange line is 2020. You still see the drop when the city shut down, but starting around April 1st, the number of trips taken on city bikes has been steadily rising, and it's now close to the same levels of 2019. You can see that here. The year started with more city bike ridership, and it dropped to around 75% of what it was, but then it's been rising and it's almost reaching normal levels. The city also has some bicycle counters. These are installed in bridges and in some avenues. And what's interesting here is that the year 2020 began with a lot more bicycles being counted in the city. There was a huge increase in the first few months of the year. We're actually trying to find out if this increase is a real increase, if it's really more bicycles on the streets, or if it's a problem with the counters or the way they are counting the bicycles. That being said, there was a drop, of course, but now levels are the same as they were in 2019. So according to this data, bicycle trips have picked up and recovered. And you can see it here again. There was a huge increase at the beginning, almost more than 300%, and then it dropped down to around 40% of what it was before. But then it has slowly picked up, and now it's above 2019 levels. And here you see the three data sets compared together. You can really see how subway rides went down and stayed down, whereas the other ones went down but have picked up and are at normal levels or higher than normal levels. Okay, So we wanted to do a little bit more analysis on the city bike trips. And so we disaggregated them by the time of day in which the trips occurred. The orange line is the trips around midday. So that's between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. The purple line is evening trips. So those trips between 4 p.m. And 10 p.m. The night trips are trips between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning. And the morning trips are trips between 4 a.m. and 10 a.m., which were the trips associated most of the times with commuting. You see that those morning trips are still way down. However, the midday and evening trips have picked up. So what we're trying to understand here, and we still don't have an answer to this, is whether or not the trips that are occurring these days are actual replacement for subway trips, or are different kind of trips, are trips to the grocery store, or trips around a park, or are trips just around the neighborhood. Are these, is this replacement really gonna be really gonna stay like that once the city fully reopens, or are people gonna go back to the subway to commute to work? We also split the city bike trips by their duration, again, to try to understand what types of trips we're talking about. And you see that the short trips are actually still lower than their 2019 levels. Those trips are the less than 5 minutes and between 5 minutes and 15 minutes. However, the longer trips, and this was a little bit surprising, the longer trips, those 15 minutes or more, are either at their 2019 levels or higher than their 2019 levels. So this indicates that these trips that people are taking now are not necessarily the short trips to go to the grocery store or to go around the block. Those trips might be longer trips, either going to work or taking a longer ride. Either they could be sports activities. We don't know exactly. And this is one of the challenges with this data set. Right now, it's quite hard to go to city bike stations to interview people. There's as you all know, the university has restricted the activities that we can do, but that's one of the things that we would need to do in order to understand exactly what types of trips have become more popular and what types of trips are still not as popular as they were in 2019. We've also looked at the geographic distribution of this change, because as you saw in the previous map, some parts of the city are continuing to use the subway, while others are, while in others, the subway usage is way, way lower. So
you have 2 minutes, Juan.
Perfect, thank you. So here there are 3 snapshots, so 3 different weeks. The first one is a week at the beginning of the lockdown. The second one is in April, and the third one is around phase 1 reopening. And you see that in phase 1 reopening, there are pockets of the city that are actually higher than their 2019 levels. And we've outlined Astoria, Long Island City, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Crown Heights as possible sites of where interesting things are happening with city bikes. There are many more city bike trips in those areas than there were in 2019. These are the same 3 snapshots, but these are connections between stations. And you see that there are a lot of trips in Harlem, a lot of trips on the Upper East Side, a lot of trips in Long Island City, on the East Village and Crown Heights, and some trips in on the West Side that are actually higher than what they were in 2019. Whereas the subway, everything is still down by more than 50%. But again, like in the map at the beginning, the areas of the city that have low-income neighborhoods are still registering more subway trips than the areas of the city with higher income neighborhoods. So this is something that we need to explore a little bit further in order to understand how demographics, how race and income are related to the way people are using these alternative means of transportation. This is a short list of what we need to do next. We need to continue analyzing city bike trips and bike counters, as well as subway rides, but we also need to bring in new data sets like buses, scooters, demographics, land use, economic activity, and other mobility data, just to complete the picture and really understand how COVID and the lockdown has affected our choice of transportation in New York. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Juan. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hands and we can let you speak. I wanted to start with a question before we jump to the other participants. And that is, there's two things. Do you plan to interview people who are commuting in New York and kind of get their opinions on why they're taking the subway or not taking the subway or biking or so forth? And then if you consider the total fraction of just commuters, those taking the subway versus those taking a bicycle, is the bicycle ratio now way skewed so that it's much different than last year? I assume that that's true.
The answer to the first question is yes. Ideally, we will interview people. Ideally, we will do it in different parts of the city so that we get the full range of citibike users. Ideally, we will also interview people that are not necessarily using citibike, but are using scooters or other means of transportation, bicycles, just to understand really why, sort of what their thought process is, why they're choosing this mode of transportation over the subway. In that article from the New York Times that said anything but the subway, there was a bunch of interviews of people, but we want to do that in a more systematic way. As to your question of the ratio, we don't, and if I understand the question correctly, I think that we don't know yet how many people are commuting to work. It's hard to tell the amount of economic activity that's actually open and where people need to commute to work. So it will be sort of hard to estimate what the percentage is. We will need to look at spatial information that shows us where businesses are open and where offices are open to identify those trips that are sort of commuting trips. I will say that the use of the subway in New York City dwarfs any other means of transportation. So even if subway rides have decreased dramatically, the subway is still carrying thousands more people than citibike or any other means of transportation.
Okay, Rodney, you could talk.
Yes, Juan, thank you very much. I have a question about the numbers. And city bikes from 2019 to 2020 have actually increased in number, and also subway trains have decreased in number. Is all of that reflected in the data that you presented?
So I am using the data that I'm using for subway comes directly from the MTA. It's their turnstile data. So it's how many people go through the turnstiles, either entering a subway station or exiting a subway station. What I was seeing, I can skip back. What I was seeing for subway is that the year started pretty much the same as 2019. And it actually, and it was the lockdown that made everything decrease. For citibike, there's a small caveat here. The number of stations in 2020 is much higher than the number of stations in 2019. Citibike went through a big expansion at the end of 2019. So what we did in the analysis was only select those stations, only look at those stations that were present in both 2019 and 2020. Now that introduces a couple of problems of network effects. The fact that there are more stations means that maybe more people are using the system, even though they're not using the new stations. That's a little bit difficult to at least for now, it's not necessarily that important. But yes, the year with citibike started with more riders using the system until the lockdown began, and then there was a dramatic decrease. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
No problem.
Okay.
And sorry, and the numbers for Citibike come directly from the Citibike website. They release their data every month.
Stephen Balter, you can talk.
Thank you. A general question from your original slides of making it a carless city. There are lots of people for a variety of reasons, such as disabilities, small children, age issues, who physically can't ride bikes. At some point, you might want to include those subpopulations in your analysis. Thank you.
Yes, that is a very valid point. The articles that I've seen talking about carless cities do take into account how these changes would affect certain populations. Maybe they don't go deep enough and they're not detailed enough, but there is the beginning there. I do have to say that the MTA is also going through a program of upgrading their subway stations to make them accessible. And this is one of the only areas in which they are spending money right now. Because there was a lawsuit, so they're mandated to actually upgrade their stations. But that is a big issue in New York City. Mobility for that's accessible is a big problem that needs to be addressed in any kind of future scenario.
The other thing you might want to add in the future is some data on bus utilization by MTA and other buses.
Yes, that it's in my to-do list, and there have been some articles saying that actually the buses have the use of buses hasn't decreased as much as subway during the pandemic. People feel that the buses are safer, that there is more ventilation. So yes, that's definitely in the next phase.
Thank you, and thanks for a great talk.